Forms are a vital part of any website or application, and most of the time they can be pretty tricky to style, and it usually takes a while. So let's see how Bootstrap can help us by first looking at the available form controls. Bootstrap includes support for all major form controls: text-based input fields, checkboxes, radio buttons, selects, and text areas. Speaking of input fields, you can use all of the HTML5 types, which include text, date, password, tell, email, and search. For most of them, the markup is pretty straightforward. No extra class is needed. For example, this layout, this form styling, was generated by using the default classes, or actually by not using any class at all. We just have a basic form, a basic label, and some basic inputs. However, checkboxes and radio buttons receive a small treatment via the checkbox and radio classes. These are applied to the parent label for those two controls, and they set a minimum height of 20 pixels and also some left padding. So let's check it out. I'm going to do a label with a class of checkbox, which contains an input. Input will be checkbox. We need some text inside, so simple checkbox. And there it is. On the radio buttons, it's pretty much the same. We have a label with a class of radio, which includes an input. Input type radio, and the text will be simple radio. All right. As you can see, the controls are stacked. If you want them on the same line, you must add the class of inline to the parent label. This will work for both radio buttons and checkboxes. Here's an example. I'm going to add inline here and inline here. And I'm also going to duplicate the checkboxes just to see how it looks like. Also the radio buttons. And as you can see, all the controls are now on the same line. Some forms have helper paragraphs, which are small strings of text usually placed near an input, containing some descriptive text of what that input might accept for values. So in other words, it's basically a description for that field. Bootstrap provides two classes for these: help inline and help block, and you need to add these to a span tag. So let's see an example. For instance, if I add span help block, and the result is something like this. The other one, help inline, will position the help or the description on the right side, on the same line as the input. Now notice these are not perfectly aligned. To do that, you must use the form inline class. So form inline, and everything will just line up, just like this. The default width for an input and text area is 206 pixels. This can be changed, however, by using several sizing classes, or simply matching the widths to the grid columns by using the span classes. Now, the easiest example refers to a block level form element, like an input or text area. So, for example, let's take this first input and simply add the class of input block level, and that input will fill the entire available width, thus behaving like a block level element. If you want a bit more control over the size, you can use specialized classes. There are 6 of them, and let's check them out. So the first one is input mini. It's this one. Very tiny text box. It's then followed by input small, medium, large, extra large, and extra large. Okay, so you can see all of them right here. Mini, small, medium, large, extra large, and extra large. You can also match the width of your form elements to the grid columns. Just add a span class. So here's an example with a bunch of inputs. So I'm actually going to use 2 inputs. Both of them are type text. The first one is going to be a span 6. And the second one, let's also do it a span 6. So they're both like 50-50. All right, and here it is. That's the first one, and that's the second one. Now, if you need multiple inputs on the same line, just like I did here, you can use the controls row class to apply proper margins and also clearing floats. So we're going to wrap these in a div with a class of controls first, and then controls row. Okay, so now if we check them out, you can see that the floats are cleared, and also there's a bigger gap between them. And you can do all sorts of combinations. For instance, if I have 3 inputs, I can do one of them 2 columns, the other 3, and the other 7. And I get this result. In order to provide feedback to users based on their actions, Bootstrap uses some basic styles for the inputs. For example, this is how a focused input looks like. It also works for the text area. If you want to disable an input, meaning it will be uneditable, you can add the disabled attribute. So if I want to turn off this input right here, I just have to go here and say disabled. Okay, and now this is no longer editable. It receives some background color and also the cursor changes. CSS3 added some new features that allow you to create inline validation. This basically allows for an input element to validate on the fly right after you enter some data. It uses the invalid pseudo selector, so it will only work in more modern browsers. IE 7 through 9 are not supported. So here's an example showing a classic email input. If we're going to change this first input from text to email, and also we're going to specify the required attribute. Okay, once I type in something that's not an email, the input styling will change. If I put in a valid email, the input now changes back to its original state. Speaking of validation states, Bootstrap provides some handy classes for cases when you're using external validation, such as server-side validation. And the classes are warning, error, info, and success. And you'll need to apply these to a container with a class of control group. that's used to group form controls. So here's an example. I'm going to do a div with a class of control group. And inside, we'll do a simple form structure. We'll have a label with a class of control label. This is also important. And then the actual form controls are contained in a div with a class of controls. And we can have like an input, type's going to be text, and we'll give it an ID of input warning. Now this right here looks pretty normal. Simply add the class of warning and the label color will change, and also the border and glow color of the input will change. Change the class to error, for example, and you get different colors. Also works for info, which is blue, and success, which is green. Remember the helper text we were talking about earlier? Well, if you're going to add a helper text, so help block, okay, then this text will also be colored. So we've seen the basic of forms in Bootstrap. Let's dig a little deeper and see some more options for customization and also some optional form layouts. That's coming up next.